Bare wall, a bare white wall behind us. Unfortunately, Oscar, who usually does all this wonderful work, was having a birthday earlier on last month. So we have had to redo it without the massive crowd of 6 to 10. Now look, interesting topic. You may think it's esoteric, but I think it really highlights 21st century Australia. I want to talk about 19th century trade unionism. Now I know it sounds very exciting to you, a little bit like wallpaper, but the fact is that it's a fascinating story which most people are not aware of. And I think the first thing we need to remember is that this country was based on three basic pillars, three foundation stones. Genocide of the original inhabitants who had lived here for between 60 to 70,000 years. Free land, free labour. Now I'm going to expound on these three concepts because they are the very basis of 19th century trade unionism. And as we see with the voice referendum, they are the very basis of the type of society we have become and why we've become that society. In 1788, when the colonisation process began at Port Jackson in Sydney town, 859 people were offloaded the ships, government-sponsored ships from Great Britain, to set up a penal colony in Australia. And that's the key, a penal colony. So the first European settlers were basically British armed forces and convicts. And most of the convicts that were sent here were sent for purely economic crimes because of the exceptionally difficult situation in Britain at that particular point in time. By 1850, that original 859 had grown to 405,365 individuals. So what happened between 1788 and 1850? Why was it important for the emerging trade union movement from the 1850s to the 1900s, if you're looking at the 19th century? Well, the first thing you need to remember is that Australia was, the colonised set up a penal colony, a convict economy. When you have prisoners, you have free labour. When you have genocide, you have free land. So what happened is that when you've got free land, who gets that land? Is it the convict class or is it somebody else? And obviously, it was the British ruling classes, because between 1788 and the 1840s, free immigration, especially on the East Coast, was not welcome. Squatters took up vast tracts of land on the East Coast following the genocide of the original inhabitants. For example, in Victoria, there were over 100,000 Aboriginal people in 1836 when colonisation began, and by 1850 they were down to about 2,000. But at the same time, 702 squatters took up every inch of Victoria. They didn't pay 1 cent for that land. That land was given by the British authorities to gentlemen of name and quality. I'll repeat it again. Free land was given to gentlemen of name and quality. Not immigrants, not convicts. Now these gentlemen of name and quality used that land basically to rear sheep. Because at that time, with the beginning of industrialisation in England and mechanisation and the steam engine, there was a great demand for wool. In order to rear sheep, not only do you need land and water, you also need labour. You need people. And they resolved the labour issue, because there were minimal amount of free immigrants, by assigning convicts as servants to the ruling classes, the gentlemen of name and quality. In 1791 is the first recognised strike, and that occurred amongst convicts who demanded they be given their rations daily, not weekly. But the real beginning of the trade union movement in this country happened in 1822. In February 1822, a convict, James Strater, who was working on the estate of the McCarthers, the famous McCarthers, the sheep people, had his rations reduced from 17.5 pounds of wheat per day to 9 pounds of wheat per day. That's almost 100%, a 50% decrease in his rations. When he was working at the Mount Druitt sheep stations for another squatter, he was receiving 17.5 pounds of wheat a week. 17.5 pounds a week. By the time when he started working at the McCarthers, his rations were reduced to 9 pounds of wheat a week. And that supplemented a diet of 6 pounds of meat. At the same time, he was expected to look after 350 sheep. And apart from rations and rudimentary lodgings, they received no wages. So it was free labour. It was basically slave labour. In February 1822, he began to agitate to get the rations increased. And he suggested to his fellow workers that they should prevent the sheep from lambing by not feeding them. He was arrested and he was charged with the heinous crime of inciting his master's servants to combine in order to force him to increase their wages and improve their rations. So I'll repeat it again. He was charged with this criminal offence, and he appeared in the Liverpool Magistrates Court before 3 magistrates on the 1st of March 1822, and those of you that are interested can actually look at the court transcript, which you can get through Trove. So he was charged with inciting his master's servants to combine, that's the key word, to combine, in order to oblige him to increase their wages and improve their rations. For this heinous crime, he was sentenced to 500 lashes of the whip. 500. And if you survive that, which is highly unlikely, 1 month's solitary confinement on bread and water with these festering sores on his back. And then he was sent to Port Macquarie in Western Tasmania, which was basically a convict hell on earth, where convicts used to draw straws to see who would kill whom so they would be hung. That's how bad things were. And this was for the heinous crime of inciting his master's servants to combine in order to oblige him to increase their wages and improve their rations. This is the beginning of trade unionism in this country. It's about combining together, using their collective muscle. By 1829, what we saw is skilled tradespeople, most of them convicts who'd been released, starting to form unions, very small unions. And these unions came and went over a period of time. They were basically only skilled workers were in a position to form a union. These were not massive unions. Most of them had 40 to 50 members at best. During good times, they're able to negotiate. When they withdrew their labour, what usually happened is the colonial authorities used convicts to break that strike. And because strikes began to become a feature of skilled workers who were, skilled convicts who'd been served their sentence, a new act was passed. That was the Masters and Servants Act, which was passed in 1828. And that meant that a worker, and I'm not talking about convicts, we're talking about workers who didn't do their work properly or tried to change their jobs without permission, were jailed. And if you look at the newspapers of that period, you'll see rewards being offered for the recapture of men who had left their employment without permission. Not only did they have their wages docked, but they were jailed. As far as the master was concerned, the penalty was very minimal. If he mistreated his workers, the maximum penalty was 6 months back wages. That's the maximum penalty. So the Masters and Servants Act was put in for a very good reason. Because you've got to remember there's a constant interchange between England and New South Wales as more and more convicts are sent across, as more and more revolts occurred in England. In 1811 and 1812, we had the revolts of the Luddites. The Luddites' leader was the imaginary Ned Ludd. And the Luddites were basically weavers from northern England who were concerned about the introduction of the steam engine and automation in the woolen mills. So there's the connection. The wool from Australia for the woolen mills, and a number of hundreds were arrested, thousands were arrested, hundreds were hung, and many were sent to Australia as convicts. At the same time, you've got increasing agitation in England because of depressions. There was a depression after the Napoleonic War. We all think about it as a great victory, but the fact is that as far as the common people was concerned, it caused a lot of damage and hunger. And what happened is, as mechanisation entered the agricultural world in the 1830s, the labourers in southern England, who were paid about a third of what labourers in northern England were paid, began to agitate and get involved in struggle under the fictional character called Captain Swing, which comes from the idea of people swinging in the wind when they're hung, Captain Swing. And he was a bogeyman for the landowners in southern England. The revolt was so successful that the government of the day offered rewards of £500 for the arrest and conviction of arsonists or machine breakers. That's 20 years' wages. It's a little bit like the government here offering $5 million to somebody which is unheard of. £500. Over 2,000 labourers were arrested. 256 were sentenced to hang, but only 19 were hung. And 481 were sent to Australia as convicts for terms from 7 to 14 years. So here again we have people who were combining to improve their conditions being sent to Australia as convicts, and that acted as a radicalisation in terms of giving an impetus to a developing trade union movement. The trade union movement was expanding in New South Wales until the 1840 Depression. And what occurred during the Depression is most of the unions folded, because you need to remember in 1840 there is no social security system, so if you can't get work you starve or your family starves, and that's what the labourers in southern England were protesting about. The fact that once machines came into their industry, thousands, tens of thousands were laid off and forced into the hellholes to the new factories in the cities, and they had nothing to fall back on. So if you lost your job during that period, that was basically the end of you. There was no social security system. Although some of the early trade unions tried to form mutual aid societies to assist their members in times of stress. But during the 1840s depression, which had a profound impact in the new colony in Melbourne and New South Wales, what happened is that those wages and conditions which had been established by the emerging trade union movement were undermined by people looking for work who were willing to work for a third or a quarter or a fifth or a tenth of what was supposedly the average wage, and obviously employers took advantage of that. So by 1850, there are only about 500 trade unionists in a population of over 400,000. So the trade union movement was exceptionally weak. It got an impetus with the finding of gold in Victoria in 1851. But before that, what was occurring is immigrants were beginning to trickle into New South Wales, and they found it almost impossible to compete against slaves, convicts, who were providing the bulk of the labour force. And they began to agitate for the end of transportation, the end of convicts to be sent to Australia. And the Anti-Transport League was formed in 1846. It gained a lot of support from freed convicts who now found themselves in the situation where they were being paid in rations, not money, although they were no longer convicts. And in 1847 or 48, when the Randolph, which was a convict ship, arrived in Melbourne, there were riots and the ship went to Sydney. There were riots, the ship went to Queensland, to Brisbane, and eventually the convicts were dislodged. So by the late 1850s, the transportation of convicts to eastern Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania, ceased. So what we had is no competition from people whose labour was used for nothing by the squatters, the gentlemen of name and quality. There was no competition. So what happened is the trade union movement emerged from this milieu with the end of transportation. It began to grow, but it only grew amongst skilled workers because they were the only ones that actually had the power, when they combined to look after their interests, to bring a particular industry to a halt. And at the very lead of this emerging, more powerful trade union movement, because there was no longer any free labour, because the convict transportation has ended in Eastern Australia, although it continued in West Australia up till the mid-1860s. But in Eastern Australia, we saw the formation of trade unions amongst skilled workers. And the most important skilled workers in an emerging economy were the stonemasons, because they were the ones who built the buildings. They built the government buildings, they built the private buildings, they had the skills. And having a monopoly on that skill allowed them to actually dictate terms to the government of the day and employers. The big rallying cry in the mid-1850s was the 8-hour day. Before that, most workers worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The skilled stonemasons demanded an 8-hour day, and their slogan was 8 hours to work, 8 hours to rest, 8 hours to sleep, 8 bob a day. Very simple slogan. the 8-hour day. And that took hold of the imagination of the stonemasons, who were in a position to impose those conditions on society at that particular point in time. Now, there is a little bit of a furphy going around that it was the Melbourne stonemasons which first won the 8-hour day. Well, it wasn't. In February 1855, the Sydney stonemasons told their employers, because they had a good union coverage on most of the stonemasons in Sydney, that in 6 months' time, in August 1855, they would be working an 8-hour day, and they expected the same pay for the 10-hour day they were now working. And they were so powerful that in August 1855, 95% of employers agreed to those terms, and that 5% that didn't agree agreed within 2 to 3 weeks. On the 21st of April 1856, the Melbourne stonemasons, following the example of the Sydney stonemasons, starting at the University of Melbourne, which they were building, went to every building site in Melbourne, including Parliament House, which was being built in Spring Street, and called off their members. And they won that 8-hour struggle that day because they were combined. Remember what James Strader was charged with: inciting his master's servants to combine to oblige him to increase their wages and improve their rations. So the key word is to combine. They were able to work collectively to improve their situation. Unfortunately, very few other trades, apart from the carpenters, were actually able to win the 8-hour day at that particular point in time, because their coverage of those workers wasn't universal as the stonemasons. Now, we see something quite extraordinary in 1859, because the trade union movement was never interested in political power in the first 60 to 70 to 80 years of European colonisation. They were interested in improving their situation through taking collective action, not through the parliamentary process. So what happened was that in 1859, Charles Jardine Donne, that's right, the man Charles Jardine Donne, was elected as the member for Collingwood into the Victorian Legislative Assembly. Obviously, the successful 1854 Eureka Rebellion and all the rights that came from that rebellion, which would be won through blood, through the sacrifice of over 50 workers who were killed on that fateful day on the 3rd of December 1854, that radical sentiment became part of the sentiment across Victoria. And they were able to organise, with their new right to vote, to actually elect Charles Don Jardine to the Legislative Assembly. Now, at that particular point in time, there was no payment for parliamentary members. It was usually the preserve of the rich and powerful, the squatters, the landowners. And Mr. Don had an interesting slogan. He said that he smashed bluestone by day and squatters by night, because Parliament met at night because people weren't being paid. They had to work during the day. So he smashed bluestone, and that's those beautiful bluestone bricks you see all over Melbourne in the buildings that survived that period, which were built during that period. He smashed bluestone by day and squatters by night. Unfortunately for Mr. Don, he got a little bit seduced by the parliamentary antics, and in 1861 he supported the Duffy Bill to give squatters rights as far as land ownership was concerned, and he lost his seat because people felt that he'd turned their back on them. But he was the first person in Australia, first worker, first trade unionist in Australia actually elected to a position in the Victorian Legislative Assembly. Because remember, the various colonies had their own structures in terms of parliamentary representation. So that period was an important period for stonemasons, but very few other workers were able to wrest that power. Now what happened is, as more and more people immigrated to Australia, we found that more and more trade unions were formed. By the 1890s, there were over 300 trade unions in this country. More and more trade unions were formed, where workers combined in order to improve their position. But we need to remember that the legacy of the trade union movement, to a significant degree, was a legacy built on racism. Because the Chinese, in many regards, were pitted against Australian workers by employers who undercut wages. And anti-Chinese sentiment was extraordinarily powerful within the emerging trade union movement. Most trade unionists didn't see Chinese workers as equivalent to themselves and saw them as unfair competition. Interestingly, the only radical activists during this period in the 1880s were the Melbourne Anarchist Club, which actually put out literature in Chinese to the Chinese population, arguing the case they were all workers suffering all from the same exploitation. And it's quite interesting that in 1879 we had the first big maritime strike in this country. And you've got to remember that ships were fundamental to Australia at that particular point in time, because it was the only means of communication and the only means to bring in workers and goods from Europe to Australia. And the maritime strike of 1879 was interesting because it was the first time the three colonies, Queensland, Victoria and Tasmania, Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria actually combined. It was the first intercolonial strike. They combined and went on strike on the 19th of November 1879. And why did they go on strike on the 19th of November 1879? Interesting. The same issue as in the 1840s. Whenever there's an economic depression, the employers were able to apply pressure on workers, whether they were unionised or not, and decreased wages. Now what happened is that in 1879 the major maritime companies employed Chinese workers at 1/3 of the wage that was being paid to European workers. That's what actually started off the strike. Now that strike succeeded in terms of the employers reinstating their workers and phasing out the Chinese gangs. But the thing is, at that particular point in time, you had two major groups in society. You had the protectionists, those who wanted to protect what they had, and we had the free traders. And the free traders used race as their calling card because they were able, to a significant degree, to actually employ people of different colours in order to push down wages. Now, unfortunately, as far as the trade union movement is concerned, they believed that this was a question of a European or white supremacy, not a question of workers' exploitation. They didn't actually see Chinese workers as exploited workers. They just saw them as competition. And the same thing went for women, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So 1879, first intercolonial strike, successful. They pushed back the employers. Now the thing is, In a capitalist society, you've got good times and bad times. And when you've got bad times and there is no social security system, there wasn't in the 19th century, you have problems. You have starvation, you have homelessness. And in Melbourne, in the late 1880s and 1890s, and the whole of the east coast of Australia, there was mass starvation, mass unemployment. Things got so bad, there was a protest of 400 people who went to the old Melbourne jail demanding to be admitted to jail because at least they'd be fed if they were in jail. And things got so difficult, there was so many riots, protests in the streets. The government, in order to try to quell the unrest, offered free land to any unemployed person who was willing to leave the city and live in the countryside. And they gave them 5 acres in the Dandenong Ranges or French Island, unproductive land, just to get them out of the city. But as far as the union movement was concerned, we saw a new unionism develop in the 1880s. And that was a unionism which was based on labour. Not skilled workers, but unskilled workers were coming together, combining in order to improve their situation. And we saw the Trades Council change, the name of the Intercolonial Council was changed to the Trades and Labour Council. And that came because of the push from unskilled or semi-skilled workers who combined to improve their situation. A classical example is the Melbourne tailoresses. The women working in sweatshops doing piecemeal work, paid less than 6pence a day, who formed a union in 1882. They formed a union in 1882 and had thousands of women joining. Interestingly, their main opposition was not just the employer, but the tailors' union, which consisted of men who had a policy of no women and no Chinese in their union. So that gives you an idea of the mentality at that particular point in time. So we've got this emerging trade union movement, and we've got this huge depression in the late 1880s and 1890s, which is having profound social impact in the society with no social security benefit. This is the era of the baby farmer. 10% of Melbourne's women were involved in prostitution, not through choice, but through desperation. Women were having babies. There are many cases of babies being thrown in the Yarra and drowning. But more important, we had a new industry which was building in Victoria, the baby farming. So if you had a baby, you'd pay somebody to look after that child while you continued your work as a prostitute. If you didn't pay them, they would kill the child and bury it in the backyard. And there are many backyards in Melbourne CBD which have bodies of babies from that period. Things got so bad, campaigns were set up to set up the first women's hospital in the 1890s, but in the Queen Victoria Hospital, that's another issue. So we've got people coming together. At the same time, with the Depression, employers believed this was the time to break the back of the emerging trade union movement. And what happened is that they spoke about individual contracts. Individual contracts. Instead of bargaining collectively with these new unions, they demanded that workers sign up on individual contracts which they set the parameters on. And obviously these individual contracts undercut wages and conditions at that particular point in time. This led to the 1890s maritime strike, another maritime strike, huge strike. which involved tens of thousands of people, which unfortunately the maritime unions lost, because at that particular point in time, at the height of depression, if you lost your job or if you didn't have a job, you starved. It was that simple. If you didn't have rich relatives or people you could, sponge off, you'd starve. Simple as that. So they were able to employ people who were non-unionised labour, and in many cases they actually gave them more money if they were non-unionised labour. And that's initially, as long as they accepted that individual contract. The same strike expanded to the shearers. Now the shearers are exceptionally important. They're an itinerant workforce which sheared sheep, and the wool was sent to England to the industrial mills, the woolen mills, which were the backbone of the British economy for decades. The fact is, the shearers were fully unionised. And it was not unusual for shearers to make life difficult for the landowners unless they received an adequate payment for their labour. So in 1891, the sheep farmers, the squatters, got together in Queensland primarily, as well as parts of New South Wales, and decided they would break the back of the trade union movement. And we had one of the most bitter strikes that has occurred in this country. And the ballad Waltzing Matilda, which some people say should have been Australia's national anthem, highlights what was happening during that period. The colonial authorities sent in armed soldiers to break up the strike. Union leaders were jailed. And workers were offered individual contracts with half or a third of the pay they were getting. And they were able to break the back of the shearer strike in 1891 and 1894 because of the depression and the need for people to work in order to survive. The failure of the maritime strike in 1890, the failure of the shearers' strike in 1891, and the failure of the shearers' strike in 1894 changed the mood of Australian workers. And not only were they interested in combining to improve their condition, the Labor Party emerged from these failures. And within 20 years, we saw the first Labor government in 1911 elected anywhere in the world in Australia, the Watson-led Labor government. So the failure of collective action, especially during periods of economic depression in an era where there was no social security benefits, led to the formation of the Australian Labor Party, which theoretically represented workers at that particular point in time. So the trade union movement, you can break up in the 19th century into 4 or 5 different groupings. One, free labour, convict labour. James Strater, sentenced to 500 lashes, 1 month in solitary confinement on bread and water, and to serve out the rest of his sentence at Port Macquarie, a hellhole, for urging or for inciting his master's servants to combine to oblige him to increase their wages and improve their rations. Then we have the emergence of the early trade unions in the 1830s and 1840s, and these were based on specific trades, and we saw the failure of these unions during the 1840s depression, when people were willing to work for anything in order to survive. Then we had the Anti-Transportation League, which meant that gentlemen of name and quality were no longer being given vast tracts of lands, hundreds of thousands of acres to grow sheep on with free labour. Then we had the evolution of the trade union movement in the 1850s, much of it revolving around the campaign for an 8-hour day. Later on that century, we had the first intercolonial strike in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, which started on the 19th of November 1879 by maritime workers. And in the 1880s and 1890s, we saw the growth of unions which were not for skilled workers. And we saw the definition of the labour movement change to the Trades and Labour Council. It was a combination, the new unionism, which was the labour unions, joined the old unionism, which was the trades union. Then we saw the failure of the large maritime strikes in 1890, the shearers' strikes in 1891 and 1894, which led to the creation of the Australian Labor Party and saw Labor, for the first time since the election of Charles Jardine Don to the Legislative Assembly in 1859 as the member for Collingwood, this is in Victoria, take on a political direction. They believe that not only did they need to use direct action, they needed to use the ballot box. So what's the lesson for 2021? You see, the word revolution comes from the word revolve. Things revolve. They come back to where they start. And it's fascinating that in 2023, that Australian workers have almost less rights than James Strater had in 1822. Let's look at it. Contracts. Individual contracts is the name of the game in 2023. Less than 20% of Australian workers are now unionised. 50 years ago it was up to 60%. And most of those that are unionised are not in the private sector, they are in the government sector at the state and federal level. We now have the ridiculous situation in this country where it is illegal to strike. You can only withdraw your labour during an enterprise bargaining agreement period after you jump through hoops. And individual workers can be fined up to $10,000 a day for not being involved in an illegal, unauthorised strike. So in many regards, when we talk about rights in China, we should actually look at the rights that workers have in Australia in 2023. Then we have legislation which has basically made most unions impotent. About all they can do is put advertising on TV during election time. And if you look at the collective bargaining system that we now have through the Fair Work Commission, in many regards it actually mirrors the Masters and Servants Act of 1828. So in regards to people being able to combine to improve their situation in the workplace, things have turned full circle. And as I said before, in many ways, we are no different to the situation in 1822. In 1822, you received 500 lashes, were imprisoned for combining to improve your situation. In 2023, you are bankrupted. You are fined $10,000 a day for removing your labour in an unauthorised strike. Now, I remember the 70s when factory occupations were important mechanisms of actually improving your situation, in the 80s and 90s, where picket lines were used to prevent non-union labour taking over union work. Today, it's illegal to have a picket line. You need a community picket. You can have trade unions which can be ostracised and banned in this country. You can be jailed for up to 25 years for being involved in an occupation of a building or a work site, and the list goes on and on. So the fact is that although 200 years have passed, 201 years to be exact, since 1822, when James Strater was flogged and imprisoned for inciting his master servants to combine to improve their situation, In 2023, we find ourselves in the same situation. And it's not about collective bargaining anymore. It's about individual contracts. And individual contracts, as we know, gives you an unequal bargaining position between you and your employer, especially if your employer is some type of multinational, transnational corporation. So we wonder, everybody wonders why in 2023 wages haven't kept pace with inflation. Why during a period of a lack of workers due to the COVID-19 pandemic, why wages haven't increased? Because traditionally we saw that during periods of scarcity of labour, wages increased. Well, they don't increase because in this country, trade unionism has basically has been outsourced to the private sector. Trade unionism is seen as some type of criminal activity. And if you look at much of the media commentary, including social media, regarding trade unionists and trade unionism and the right to withdraw labour, you will find that things have not changed very much. And Australian workers will continue to suffer if they continue to allow this situation to occur. I find it quite depressing that in 201 years later, that the sacrifice that James Strater made is not known, is not celebrated, and that the trade union movement today is a shadow, a mere shadow of its former self because of legislation which has been put in place by not just Conservative governments but by Labor governments that have forgotten that their origins stemmed from the failed maritime strike of 1890 and the shearers' strike of 1891 and 92. So think about it. You want change? Well then, that change needs to occur through the removal of legislation which criminalises workplace activity, criminalises trade unions, and which has removed the right to strike in this country.